This is the Skin Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Thomas Hitchcock, and here we'll investigate everything skin science and dissect it from a scientific perspective, analyze it from a medical perspective, critique it from a consumer perspective, and give insight from an industry perspective. Welcome back to the Skin Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Thomas Hitchcock, and with me in the studio, sitting in for Angela McDonald, is Dr. Brian Jones, who you know as a disembodied voice typically, but today we got him on camera. How you doing, Dr. Jones?
I prefer not being on camera, but that's okay. I guess I'm on camera.
He's a little camera shy, but he is a wealth of knowledge, and today's topic, I think, is especially going to benefit from his experience, and so we're really lucky to have him in the studio to talk about this topic, which I'll tell you in a second. But first, I wanted to also introduce Chad Sulak, who is new to the podcast, who's also a colleague of Dr. Jones and I. And Chad, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself and who you are, what you do with Crown, etc.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. So I am the brand manager for ProGen PRP at Crown Aesthetics. I am also a Florida native, so the topic today I am an expert on. Doesn't mean I've adhered to it, but I at least have some sort of knowledge base on it, so I think we'll be good to go.
Yeah, and so the topic, which you may have deduced from the Florida expert thing, is hanging Chads.
Yes.
No, I'm just kidding.
And how that
was a dad joke because he's Chad, whatever.
Yeah.
So it is SPF. It is also called sunscreens. Some people call it sunblocks, although I believe that was nixed a long time ago.
Nixed a long time. There's no such thing as a sunblock.
Exactly. And so there's probably other names that people use for it, but that's what we're talking about today. And now, while most people might think that that's a pretty cut and dry subject matter, everybody thinks they know what a SPF or a sunblock is. Sunscreen is. That is actually why I wanted to talk about it today, because there is a lot of miscommunication, a lot of misunderstanding about what they actually are, how they work. There's some controversies around it. And so we're going to talk about those today as well, because everybody likes a good controversy.
Of course.
I mean, everybody likes train wreck TV, so we're going to try to make some today. I want to start that whole discussion with kind of a overarching definition of what a sunscreen is. Now, what we do on this podcast typically is we try to look at it from different angles, from scientific angle, from a consumer angle, from an industry angle. Sometimes they all match. Sometimes there's a little bit of, disagreement between the definitions. And so, Chad, you said you were an expert.
Yes, and being from Florida, I'm an expert at being from Florida. That's what I'm an expert at.
Right. Okay, so being from Florida and being an expert, what do you consider the definition of a sunscreen?
So what I consider the definition today versus growing up in Florida, when I was growing up, I always viewed sunscreen as, it protected you from the sun, and the amount of time it did that was on the bottle. So an SPF 15 gave you 15 minutes of protection, 30 minutes, and so on and so forth.
Right.
Today, I know that not to be the case, right? It's more of how long it protects you on an individual basis from getting red. Meaning, and I could be wrong here, right?
Hey, that's what you're here for.
That's kind of the point.
To be wrong so we can look smarter.
Is that if it takes me a minute before I get red in the sun and I put on SPF 15, it'll block me for 15 minutes versus if it takes you 2 minutes to get red, an SPF 15 will block you for 30 minutes. So it's kind of the amplification of protection on an individualized basis. Basically not a one-size-fits-all formula for sun protection.
Okay, and so that's still a pretty broad definition, right?
Extremely broad, yes.
All right, so Brian, I'm actually, before I go to you, because he brought it up, I want to read what the FDA says about what SPF is, because he brought up kind of part of their blurb. And so the FDA on their sites specifically states that SPF is a measure of how much solar energy, or UV radiation, is required to produce sunburn on protective skin relative to the amount of solar energy required to produce sunburn on unprotected skin, which is kind of what he said.
Yeah.
So as the SPF value increases, sunburn protection increases. So there is a popular misconception that SPF relates to time of solar exposure. For example, many consumers believe that if they normally get sunburn in 1 hour, then an SPF 15 sunscreen allows them to stay in the sun for 15 hours, which actually was kind of what he said too.
True.
Without getting sunburnt. This is not true because SPF is not directly related to time of solar exposure, but to the amount of solar exposure. Although solar energy amount is related to solar exposure time, there are other factors that impact the amount of solar energy. For example, the intensity of solar energy impacts the amount. The following exposures may result in the same amount of solar energy: 1 hour at 9 a.m. and 15 minutes at 1 p.m. Dr. Jones, can you boil that down to what that FDA jargon means? I mean, it was pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, it's a pretty good example as towards how it really actually works. And then it's the total amount of energy that's actually absorbed. So it's what's called a minimal erythemic dose, or MED. And so
what was the middle word?
Erythemic.
Erythemic. Okay, so redness.
Erythema dose.
Yeah.
And again, that's the energy that is required to cause your skin to turn red. So again, for 1 MED, that's typically what's used in testing. A SPF 15 will be able to handle 15 times 1 MED for a given individual, or 30 for an SPF 30, or 45 or 50, and so on. Now, that's not having to do with necessarily the absorption of UV light, but just the energy of UV light.
Mm-hmm. So it's not the time.
And not
has to
the
do
time.
just turning red.
And as you mentioned, it's essentially someone that goes out for the sun at 9 a.m. probably doesn't have to worry about wearing a sunscreen. Now, if they go at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning, or going towards noon or early afternoon, then they would. And that would be much higher energy absorption versus they get in the evening or in the morning.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get into the testing part in a bit, because it's one of those things where it's a little odd when you actually watch it being done. But and I'm not sure I would volunteer to be one of the test subjects. But before we get into that, Chad, did that change the way that you view the definition of sunscreen at all?
Oh yeah, it made it much more confusing. I mean, I would say this from an FDA standpoint, they're very scientific.
Mm-hmm.
I get it. However, from a manufacturer standpoint, I think they chose the most confusing way to market it possible. Because SPF 15, 30, 45, you would correlate it just like that. Like, oh, I have 15 minutes or 30 minutes. No one's going to be like, oh, well, what's the MED that's going to, and am I putting it at what time? There has to be a better way, like small, medium, large. I don't know.
In a way, you're actually right. So at that given time, essentially that 15 minutes, say that at 11 o'clock in the morning, you can go out for 15 minutes and not be burnt, or that's the amount of energy necessary for you to be burnt. You can go for an SPF 15 times that. But for 3 o'clock, when the energy is higher, you may only be able to go out for 5 minutes.
Which is confusing to his point.
Yeah. It's very confusing.
And I think it's even more confusing when we can get into this a little later too, which is the idea that the difference between like an SPF 50 and 100 and the amount of extra protection that you get, people would think there's twice the amount of protection, which we know is not the case.
Well, for the amount of energy, that actually is.
Right.
But actually for the amount of UV absorption, it's not.
Exactly, which is confusing.
Yeah, so
I must say, even as a scientist, I agree that is not the best way for consumers to understand it. But I guess in a sense, it's pretty self-explanatory. 50 is less than 100. Right. The real question is whether it is worthwhile to put on 100 versus 50. And then we can also discuss at some point whether there's any issue with the amount of chemicals that we put on our skin, whether the extra, risk, if there is any, is worth the benefit. So we'll get into that in a second. Okay. But I guess really what I would like to do now, because we just defined a broad sense what a sunscreen is, what an SPF is, but what many people get slightly confused about is the different chemicals, because there are some easier to remember names like zinc oxide, and then there's some harder ones like octocrylene and octobenzone and
octades.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of octas, and so really, Brian, why don't you walk us through the different type of ingredients that would be considered technically, it doesn't have, and we can talk about the regulatory as well, but technically, what is considered a sunscreen when I put it on my skin?
Well, any chemical that's, well, let me back up. The vernacular is typically is that a chemical sunscreen is a chemical versus a particle like titanium dioxide or zinc oxide. And they usually consider those as towards being particle sunscreen or non-chemical sunscreen, but all of them are chemicals.
Right. And I think that's something that we should drive home, is that in the skincare industry and the, including therapeutics, there's this kind of idea that natural may be better, that chemicals are bad. But in the grand scheme of things, water is a chemical. Everything's a chemical. Now, that doesn't mean that we should put any chemical on our skin, like we shouldn't put formaldehyde on our skin and such. But we have to be careful about equating chemical to bad and natural to good.
Correct. Well, when you think about zinc oxide and titanium, they're actually not natural materials because they get heavily processed. And so titanium dioxide actually goes to titanium TiO4 and then is back reduced to TiO2. So there actually is a lot of chemical processes to make them white or to make them more pure, because again, coming from nature, is that when they're mined, actually a lot of materials that people don't want. So really, when you think about it, is that
they have to refine it. Yeah,
the refining causes more influence again regarding the material than what you get from a synthetic or a organic sunscreen.
So, Dr. Jones, how many chemicals do you actually need in a sunscreen? If you're going to make the most bare bones sunscreen possible, how many chemicals would you actually need in it?
Well, it depends on which sunscreen what you're trying to cover is towards UVA and UVB is for the types of ultraviolet light that you're trying to protect. So there are things like avobenzone, which is a chemical or a organic sunscreen called partial 1789 as well, that actually has a very broad UVA, UVB spectrum absorption. Then you've got titanium dioxide that actually covers a little bit into UVB and to UVA. Then you got zinc oxide, which has a much broader range as towards covering UVA and UVB.
So a lot of times they're going to combine the types in order to get the broadest range for protection.
Correct. Because you want a balanced protection.
Right.
You don't want essentially everything to be UVB, and then everybody goes out in the sun, they don't turn red or burn their skin. They're being exposed to UVA, which causes photo damage to their skin, as well as can cause cancer.
Yeah, I want to put a pin in the types of radiation, because I do want to make sure we cover that for people to understand why that's important, the differences between UVA, B, visible light, which we'll talk about, blue light, which is kind of a trendy topic that I do want to cover.
Okay.
Were you going to say something, Chad?
I have blue light glasses, but that's besides the
blue blockers.
Blue blockers, yes, they're great at 6 a.m.
Well, it actually makes sense for the eye, as far as the viable tissue on the eye, versus having a stratum corneum, which is a non-viable tissue that actually helps protect your skin. So you don't get that same protection in the eye that you get with the skin. So blue light block for your eyes may make sense.
It's good. Yeah, good to know.
Yeah.
For your skin, maybe not so much.
Well, let's put a pin also in the blue light, because I do want. But let's finish. So we talked about physical or inorganic versus chemical or organic, and again, we have to be careful that people don't hear these terms and think of them in a reductive manner, because even while you were talking, I could hear people probably being skewed one way or another based off of the way marketing positions these ingredients. Now, when you asked about what is bare minimum to make a sunscreen, again, he's correct, is that most of the time you don't want to go bare minimum. You want to make sure you're blocking as much of that. So the actives, let's say you have 2 or 3 actives in there, like a lot of times for mineral, it's going to be a combination of zinc and titanium to try to get the broadest coverage. But some others will throw in a chemical or organic as well to get even more coverage. Some people don't care. They'll walk around with a white face.
Right.
Other people want us to hide it. And so that's where you start to run into problems, is when the elegance, the cosmetic elegance, the smell, the way it spreads, when that becomes more important than the actual protection, which actually most consumers, it probably is more important, especially if they're going to wear it every day, like a woman who wears it under makeup. Then it becomes an issue, because a lot of times I think it's formulated to be more elegant than it is protective.
Correct. And when you look at that, there's certain limitations regarding titanium dioxide and zinc oxide towards what SPF they can reach. and then they started getting to your point of being cosmetically unelegant, and nobody's going to wear them, or they're going to look like
Zuckerberg on his wakeboard or whatever it was.
So let me ask this question. This might be jumping the gun here.
Don't sue us, Zuckerberg.
Yeah. In the really, really expensive sunscreens or moisturizers with sunscreens, right? 50, 60, whatever dollars a bottle. There's usually less ingredients. But if you go to a convenience store and pick up a bottle of generic name brand, the list of ingredients is long as can be. Why is it more expensive for less ingredients and less expensive for more ingredients?
Well, I will say the testing is the same regardless if it's a $100 bottle or a $5 bottle. The testing.
So I'm overpaying is what you're saying.
Well, if you're just looking for an SPF value and that's what you're looking for, you're overpaying.
Great.
Yeah, and this comes to a formulations thing, so I can't speak for broadly to every example, but you have to remember, some of that's marketing, because just because something's more expensive doesn't mean it's a better product. And then B, the second thing is sometimes ingredients are more expensive than others. So some companies will opt to put in cheaper ingredients because there's multiple things that they can lean on, like aloe or something like that, or vitamin E or something for marketing purposes. And then others might just lean on a more expensive ingredient because it has more clinical studies behind it. So it's really a branding decision. At a certain point, you get the same functionality as Dr. Jones was alluding to. You get the same functionality. It then becomes whether it's cosmetically elegant.
Fair enough.
And one of the things that we haven't mentioned, well, I guess we have in a way, is we mentioned zinc and titanium, but we didn't mention the tint like iron oxide, which has utility as well.
It has some utility. It doesn't have quite the same absorption of titanium, regular white oxide.
Well, it's for UV, right? But it has more for visible light, I believe, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
So, and that's why it provides the color in color cosmetics is towards iron oxides.
Right.
But their ability to absorb UV is less than both titanium oxide and zinc oxide.
So that's why they would combine titanium with iron oxide and whatnot. But titanium, and I think that's the other thing that we have to make people aware of, is that sometimes ingredients that are used for sunscreens can be used cosmetically at low doses that don't really benefit UV.
SPF, right.
Yeah, and so because titanium dioxide can actually be used as a pigment.
Correct.
A white pigment. So then it may not actually do as much of the absorption as it would if it's properly formulated, because it's probably a larger molecule at that time, or a particle, I'm sorry.
Right. Again, just the fact that people probably won't apply as much to their skin.
Yeah.
And the concentration.
Because it's makeup at that point, right?
Correct.
Yeah, it has a pigment.
Right.
So in that inference, right, in that specific chemical, there it requires a certain amount before it can actually be effective at blocking ultraviolet light. If it's in a product, can it be marketed as a sunscreen if it doesn't have enough of it in it, even though it has those properties? Or does it have to reach a minimum threshold?
No, it's a little bit different than some of the other monographs in regarding the fact that you actually have to do actual testing on your product to show that it actually has SPF benefit. So where it just has to have an amount, to say for acne, benzoyl peroxide, you can have up to 10%, or salicylic acid, you can have 2%, and make the claim. You don't have to actually test those products. But for sunscreen products, you actually have to physically test the product.
Right. So there's an example in our own portfolio that I won't name the name because I don't want to get in trouble by regulatory bodies. But we actually had a series of products that actually had iron oxide and some other sunscreen ingredients for cosmetic elegance. And we tested it, and it was SPF of 30. Yet in order to market to that, you'd have to do all the testing, which, is not free.
Right.
You can do some in vitro testing that gives you kind of an idea, but you can't use that. You have to do the actual in vivo testing.
And all the other additional work on that is towards the stability work, and also all the paperwork that goes along with that has to come into play. Because
you have to show that those ingredients are stable.
Correct.
Which is different. You don't need to do that for a cosmetic pigment.
So is that why there's not just sunscreen in everything? Like, why isn't every lotion and moisturizer have sunscreen in it? I mean, people are putting it on and going outside.
And there's some people that are hesitant to put on sunscreen on, especially at night. They're going, why do I need a sunscreen at night? So so they want a moisturizer that doesn't have sunscreen.
That's true. So, and as we talked about the cosmetic elegance, it's really hard to formulate a sunscreen that feels really great, because a lot of times you can tell you have something on.
Yeah.
And the companies that make sunscreens where you just simply can't tell, you then question whether or not you're truly being protected.
Right.
And so it's a really hard balance to achieve as a formulator.
And you need additional materials in those sunscreen products that are essentially called film formers that actually cause the sunscreen to lay down in a nice pattern, even pattern across the skin. Because the skin isn't actually flat, it's actually very rough as far as texture. And so you need to be able to make sure that the sunscreen is staying in places towards the peaks and valleys of your skin and not essentially leaving little tops of your skin exposed to get hit by UV light and causing damage.
So that's an interesting question, or it makes me think of an interesting question.
All right.
Spray sunscreen versus rub-on gel. Am I jumping the gun here?
No. It's a really good question.
Is one better than the other? Does one cover more? I mean, you'd think, in my personal thinking about it, right? I'm thinking of a spray paint can, right? You spray paint something, the paint goes everywhere, versus a paintbrush is very direct. So on one, it's more broad, but I think it would get in the peaks and valleys more, versus a topical one might be a thicker coat, but you have to make sure you're covering everything.
That's actually a good point, and there's actually a lot of controversy around this.
Right, and it all deals with the amount of product that actually being laid down onto the skin.
Right, because, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Because actually the testing is done at 2 milligrams per centimeter squared. So when you think about what that means as towards for a lotion, that means that you need like a shot glass to cover your entire body, roughly, like 30 grams. So
that's it?
Well, when you think about a bottle, it only contains about 120 grams.
Right.
So you get maybe 4 applications from a bottle.
Which I think is
Nobody
a lie.
ever uses
Yeah,
them.
I'm lucky to get one.
Well,
but I'm just doing something wrong.
Really?
I mean, I
Jeez,
lather
he
up.
slathers it on. Well,
Okay.
then you're doing a good job.
Thank you
if
very
you're
much.
putting that much on.
I don't have a base coat. I go from white to red. There's no middle ground.
Okay.
I'm the same.
Yeah.
I burn.
Happens to
That's
the
all I
best
do.
of us.
Well, the interesting thing is the SPF products for like powders, and that when you think about the amount of powders that have to be applied, essentially, you're going to put on so much powder that you actually physically can't do it because it actually will fall off your skin
Right.
to actually reach the SPF that actually is tested.
I didn't actually know there were powdered SPFs.
There are actually, and they sell them. I'm not going to name names again because I don't want to get sued. But there's actually multiple brands that sell these brushes with a powder inside, and it has been a point of controversy because basically one wonders what the ethics are of claiming one thing if you know it's not really reaching that. But it all does come down to, there is a certain onus of the consumer to know how to properly apply sunscreen. And what Brian was just mentioning is that you have to put it on pretty thick for you to get it, which you apparently do, to where it's actually protecting. And that's where the sprays versus the lotions actually is a little controversial because sprays are more convenient, right? Because you can just spray and you feel like as long as I hit that spot, that it's covered. But the real question is just by one kind of mist over a skin getting the full amount of SPF, or do you have to do multiple coats, to get that SPF? And really comes down to how it was tested.
Right.
Because they don't spray it when they test. They don't spray it on. They take a spatula and put it on.
So I was going to ask this is an opinion question for both of you. Knowing that, right, and I'm sure they have the research that shows people don't apply it properly
Oh, the 100%
all the time.
do. Yeah.
Should the way that it's marketed, right, SPF 15, change in conjunction with how people are actually utilizing the product?
Well, you bring up a great question because that's actually what the American Academy of Dermatology said for the recommendation. So originally it was an SPF 15. People weren't putting enough product on there to actually get the 15. So they actually upped the ante to SPF 30 so that people would actually use enough of it to actually get an SPF 15.
Right.
So you heard it here first. You're doing it wrong. What you're getting is half of what you think you're getting.
Well,
Probably less.
Yeah, probably less.
The problem is, and again, I think that's where, companies like Crown, part of our marketing is education around how to properly apply things. And, one of the things that we very much try to do is make sure that the consumer has every opportunity to use things correctly, because we understand that there's in skincare and dermatology, there's very few breakthroughs of innovation, especially when you have to and we did miss out on defining some other types of ingredients, which we'll go back to, that are sunscreens. But with the to be a sunscreen, you have to have a monograph, and for the ingredient that's considered a sunscreen, and that means that you have to go through the FDA to do that, which most companies don't want to do because it costs time and money.
Well, and now it's becoming much more difficult with the FDA. But the last sunscreen active that was approved was avobenzone, which was back in 2006. So it's been almost, 18 years.
Really? So when a new sunscreen comes on the market, it's just a rebrand of something old, or
it's just a reformulation.
reformulation?
A lot of times it's, trying to make it more elegant. Different brands have different kind of, shticks about what makes theirs unique within the niche. A lot of brands, like for instance, our brand Blue Lizard, we're very much focused on mineral based.
Right.
So much so that we were initially mineral based, and now we've gone to where most of our products are purely mineral as far as the monographed ingredients. And so, other brands are more, want to be more chemical based because those are more sheer. So you don't have the white cast as much.
Right.
And so there's a lot of kind of discussion about, like, for instance, of people of color. They feel, from when I've interacted with people who have tested the Blue Lizard brands and such, that even the sheer lotions that we make for a dark skinned individual, you can still see a cast of some sort. And so they feel that doesn't really serve their demographic that well. And there are certain brands out there, like I believe one is called like Black Girl or something like that. I think
we've got tinted, people have tinted sunscreen.
No, it's not tinted. I think it's mostly chemical.
Okay.
And so it's formulated for darker skin types.
Right.
Yeah.
But then, we get into the whole controversy about whether there is any reason why you shouldn't use purely chemical or physical. We'll get into that in a second. First, I did want to give Dr. Jones the opportunity to finish the list. We've got the physical or inorganic.
Well, there's a number of ways of different things.
Yeah.
You think about the soluble versus the insoluble. So
Okay.
The soluble being what would be termed as towards the chemical sunscreens or the organic sunscreens. You got the
Which would be water soluble, so you can
oil soluble
or oil soluble, yeah. And so you can actually put them into solution. I'm not sure if there's a better way to say that.
So it becomes essentially clear or near clear, essentially formulations.
So they are sheer.
Sheer. A lot of times it's towards, you mentioned towards sprays. A lot of times those are going to be those that are soluble actives versus insoluble titanium and zinc.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually a number of different, there's particle versus non-particle. Particle, of course, being zinc and titanium. Non-particle being the more typical chemical or organic sunscreens.
And then there's particle size.
And there's particle sizes too,
which is a whole other thing.
Which we could talk about as far as what benefit as far as, and there's also not only particle size as far as what you put in, but also how much energy you make in the formulation and how much aggregation occurs regarding the particles.
And then there's the coated particles.
and coated particles to avoid essentially free radical formation.
And also can hide it more cosmetically as well.
So when you think about it, it's not something, it's probably the most difficult formulations to come up with are sunscreen formulations because they're so complicated regarding how they are made and how they need to end up being consistent to perform properly as towards for you or me or anybody else that's utilizing the product. They're doing it over a period of time as towards that the products are stable.
Yeah, and that's why when our team of formulators at Crown, a lot of what they've done for the past umpteen years, has all been mostly sunscreen, and then it's only recently, like in 2017, where we started to get more into other types of avenues. But the lift that some of our colleagues have done to make the products as good as they are is commendable, and I don't think they get enough recognition. Maybe I can list them on the screen here or something. But if you ever get a chance, you should find one of the Crown formulators and thank them for all the work that they do to make them as cosmetically elegant yet effective as they are. There's also a couple other things like I do want to talk about, which is antioxidants and boosters, which are two things that, so antioxidants, most people know what those are, but they don't realize that they actually have some sort of benefit when it comes to things like UV radiation.
Right. So they actually help in regard, for SPF testing, it actually looks at redness. We talked about that before at the very beginning of the talk. And so if they're able to help attenuate or reduce the amount of redness, it actually boosts essentially the SPF values regarding the particular products. Then you also mentioned boosters, which are essentially chemicals that are very similar to those that are found on the monograph that actually have benefits towards absorption of UV light that actually push the SPF value to a higher number. Because again, there, a lot of times on like zinc oxide or titanium dioxide, to get something that's elegant, you really can't get past an SPF 30. And so, but again, people want to have SPF 50s or higher, and so a lot of times boosters are used in order to get that SPF value.
Yeah, and so I guess to put that kind of into layman's terms is that you're trying to basically use a sunscreen that isn't approved as a sunscreen to get a higher sunscreen value because you can only claim certain ingredients as sunscreens.
They have a very similar benefit as towards monograph sunscreen actives.
Right, and so that's a trick that that a lot of companies can use is that if you don't have something on a monograph, you can include something that's useful for that purpose. You just can't claim that ingredient does that specific thing unless the FDA has cleared it or approved it for that particular use. So antioxidants, I do want, because that's what antioxidants I think are one of those things where everybody knows they're good, but I don't think people understand that antioxidants in your skin are actually pretty essential to controlling photo damage and keeping it under control as far as our natural sunscreen, if you want to call it that. So the oils that we make, the sebum that we make, has vitamin E in it. And there's other antioxidants that our microbiome makes. And so, we inherently, and also melanin, we have the melanin, which is our natural SPF. Right. The problem is that for people like us, doesn't really pop out until we've been damaged by the sun.
After the fact.
So it's basically an injury that causes that. But we do always have those antioxidants. And the microbiome, as we all know, I have to bring everything to the microbiome.
Every time.
But the microbiome puts out a pretty copious amount of antioxidant molecules, and we're just grasping the extent of what that benefit is. And so it comes down to, because you have to ask yourself, there was probably a good few years before mankind created sunscreen.
At least 3.
At least 3 or 4
At
years.
least 3.
And somehow we got here.
Yeah.
I don't know how, but somehow we got here. And so there has to be some mechanism inherent in the human body. Now, one could say, yeah, but they probably look old and wrinkled, and we died at 40. And, I don't know. There's some religious texts that say people lived to like 900. So I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. I don't claim to know. I wasn't there. But what I guess my point is that antioxidants actually, because UV radiation, part of the way it damages us is by causing free radical production in the skin. It can directly hit our DNA, cause thymine dimers and such, but part of it is also excitation of certain molecules to cause oxidation and free radical damage. And part of the reason why antioxidants are beneficial is because it prevents that constitutive amount of constant bombardment, and that's also by incidental sunlight.
Right, and that's also some of the reasons why people talk about ingestibles now again, the FDA is essentially poo-pooed all that essentially, but and it hasn't really been demonstrated to be that effective as towards ingestibles regarding antioxidants and having benefit towards UV exposure. But again, that's what the premise is behind taking ingestibles for UV benefit.
Right. That's actually a great point, because I did hear a podcast that they were talking about. It was a longevity podcast, and they were talking about the fact that antioxidants really do not benefit longevity, meaning you can take antioxidants, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't help the longevity of your skin, meaning doesn't mean they're useless for keeping the skin cells less senescent or less photo damaged. And so, one of the things that we have to be careful is that just because something's not useful in one way doesn't mean it's not useful in another way.
Right.
So similar to my feelings on GI probiotics, just because they're useful in the gut doesn't mean you should slather them on your face. And that's the type of feeling. So now that we've kind of talked about all of the types of sunscreens that are on the market, kind of the formulations and why they are certain ways, let's get into a little bit of the controversies.
Oh, yes. My favorite part.
Yeah. Most people are going to tune in for this. We'll have to make a special segment called Controversies in Skincare or something.
Train crash leading us into
there's
it.
enough for sunscreen to keep a whole episode, I think.
Right. That's true. And so I think what we'll start with is probably the latest one. I believe it's the latest one, which is the benzene. Mm-hmm. That's the latest one, right? Yeah. The latest one.
Correct.
They were pretty close together, the last two. But the benzene one, can you explain a little bit of where that came from? And
well, the issue with benzene is that it's a carcinogen as well as a reproductive toxicant. And so there's concern that essentially that people are applying it on their skin, being exposed to a material that's going to cause cancer or cause reproductive harm, and therefore it's bad.
Yeah, it's bad.
And
even in small amounts, it's not necessarily good for you, but there is a tolerance, right?
Correct.
So the FDA has a small amount that is allowable.
And normally, as far as benzene, is formed as far as with automotive exhaust, as far as any type of burning of materials. Essentially, benzene is formed. So again, there's a lot of environmental exposures to it, and there naturally would be, if you took the normal air, you'd find benzene in it to some extent. So that's where it comes into play, is that nothing's going to be necessarily free of benzene. And so with new analytical methods that you're able to tell parts per billion, you're able to pick things up that you weren't able to pick up before. And so now people are concerned and take it to the next level and saying, okay, you've got benzene in there. I can't have any benzene whatsoever in my product, so therefore it's got to be a bad product.
Right, and so one of the ways to avoid that, because benzene is actually something that is part of the manufacturing, it's a byproduct of manufacturing for some of these, what we call chemical sunscreens, because those benzene rings are part of the molecular structure.
Acrylene in particular.
Yeah, exactly. Now, part of the way that you can mitigate that is by using a mineral only, because it's less likely to have contamination, although most companies check for contamination of the sunscreen ingredients when they get them in-house before they manufacture and mix them. And now I think there is even more scrutiny because of what happened.
Right.
Now, interestingly, I don't know if either of you have HBO Max. I'm not even sure if I should say that on the air, but don't sue us, please. But they just came out with a little series of 4 episodes of like beauty type of industries, like hair, nails, skin, and the industries that make these products. And it doesn't focus on anything good, let me tell you. It did not paint these industries in a good light.
I don't think anyone wants to watch feel good about the industry. People
people
want the dirty.
Right. I mean, it basically...
one movie also has a good feeling towards cosmetic products or companies. I mean, Batman and everything else is towards, the Joker, essentially.
It's true.
It's all linked towards cosmetics, and that the fact that he poisons everybody through cosmetics.
And do you remember The Incredible Shrinking Woman?
And
back in like the 70s? Right. I mean... That was when I wasn't born yet, but
yeah, I wasn't a glimmer in my parents' eyes. I didn't exist in the world.
Catwoman. I mean, you name it, it's towards everybody goes against cosmetic companies because again, it's
an easy
it's low hanging fruit.
But at the end of the day, one of the things that I will say is that I cannot claim that every cosmetic and skincare company is the best actor. There are a lot of wonderful companies that want to do good for people. Unfortunately, this show did not claim that. It was mostly like they're all bad type of, the way that they positioned it. Regardless, the reason I bring it up is because part of what they were talking about is some molecules that are found there are certain ingredients that the FDA does not require that you disclose all, like for instance, fragrances. They don't require that you disclose everything in there. And there are some good, like I particularly like to encourage my formulators to use good ingredients that just smell good rather than fragrance, because it's transparent, meaning the consumer can read what it is on the inky. And usually it's not, I prefer those because it then has an extra benefit than just a smell. And so that's my personal preference, although there's very many points of views on this. But they were talking about how certain ingredients actually have parts per billion types of contaminants, and then they talk about how not only does you put it on your skin and it could have an issue, but also it can get into the environment, and so let's talk about that a little bit, because I don't think we've talked about this, but Dr. Jones is actually trained as a toxicologist, although he has way more experience than that now. Back in the day, when he was just knee-high to a grasshopper, he was a toxicologist. And so he's got some interesting insights on this probably, I'm assuming.
Sure. Again, when you think about, contaminants that are found there, again, most of these contaminants are actually not built within the material itself. It's actually from the environment that it's actually exposed to. So again, like we just mentioned before, as towards exhaust fumes, as towards hydrocarbons that are burnt, produce benzene, and they produce quite a bit of benzene. And just normal, exposure, if you're to wipe this table, you'll find benzene on this table. Now nobody really thinks about that as far as normal exposures, and no one's essentially wiping themselves along the table. But again, these numbers and these exposures are very typical of what you'd see normally, and it's not only indicative of the cosmetic industry, but it's indicative of food.
That's right.
And other exposures of people, clothing and the like.
So wait, benzene in sunscreens. When there's benzene in it, obviously it's not a lot, right? Because it can have cancerous effects. How much of it do you really need to put on your skin before you would actually see some sort of adverse effect? Is it such a negligible amount in these sunscreens that you would have to put on a gallon of it to even feel remote?
Well, a gallon of it or exposure for long periods of time, higher than what's actually found in the product. So when you look at, California has what's called Prop 65, which is a listing of known reproductive and carcinogen inducing ingredients.
Which is everything. If you've been to California, everything causes cancer.
Everything, they put a label on it now because, again, it's easier because they're not able to show that it doesn't have any in there because, again, there just is ubiquitous levels found, very, very low levels in pretty much everything.
Right.
Which makes it kind of useless.
Yeah, and
that's a different story.
It's true. And what you just said is actually a longer debate that we don't want to take too much time because, frankly, anything in excess is bad for you.
Right.
Like you could say that refined sugar is a cancer former because in all actuality, or a diabetes former, because the thing is, it is tied to those disease states. Yet we don't ban refined sugar. If anything, we should.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like that. I'm not going to get into that.
That's an American revolution.
But
or tobacco
So and tobacco. Don't even get us started on the amount of chemicals in that. But anyway, so now we're talking about benzene. But now let's talk about not benzene, but just the sunscreens themselves, the ones that we're calling chemical, the organic ones. And the fact that the FDA actually did a study, I believe.
Correct.
And they actually found that there was significant amounts.
It's measurable amounts. Essentially 0.5 nanograms.
I stand corrected. Measurable amounts. Words matter. Measurable amounts in the blood when you apply them topically. Now, one of the things that, as a skin scientist, I know is that it's not exactly easy to get things through the skin when they're large molecules.
Right.
But when they're small molecules, it's not that hard, especially if they're oil soluble.
Which are essentially the organic sunscreens are oil soluble, and they're small.
Right.
Relatively.
So that's a bit of controversy because, for instance, there was a certain guy on Instagram that's an influencer. He's an MD. And my friend sent me this reel where he basically he reacted to this person slathering sunscreen like you do apparently on his body, and he's like, "What kind of BS is this? Sunscreens are BS." And he basically said that they're endocrine disruptors and that they're cancer formers and that they are found in the blood and urine of people who use them. And while the spirit kind of what he was saying was useful in the sense that it's true that you have to know that this is, as a good consumer, you should realize that is the fact, that it does go into the blood. But as far as it being an endocrine disruptor and a cancer former, I think that was a bit fear-mongering.
Absolutely.
And so let's talk about that because you brought this up about how much is bad.
Right.
What's the threshold that you cross that makes it bad? And what's the evidence that says it's bad? Because to the Prop 65 thing that you were joking about is that are we as a society going to say until we prove it is good, we're not going to use it? Or are we going to say if we prove that it is bad, we're not going to use it?
Well, to expand on that a little bit, when it comes to creams versus aerosols, is the particle size bigger in one versus the other? Is applying it directly to your skin in a cream worse because there's direct contact versus aerosol where maybe 50% of it blows away in a gust? I mean, is there a difference between particle sizes on a cream versus an aerosol can, or is it all the same? It's just the delivery method.
You got to avoid those gusts.
Got to avoid. You can't. You been outside?
Yeah. Well, yes.
The answer is yes.
Good answer.
It's a complicated piece that you talk about, but again, but based on dose, a given dose, whether it be applied through an aerosol or being applied to the skin, for the most part is identical, although there's probably more solubilizers in the aerosol formulation than you would get from a topical cream.
Right.
Now, the other thing you have to worry about as an aerosol is inhalation, and the particle size for inhalation. That's particularly comes up as towards for titanium dioxide and California Prop 65, and back again on that one, it's towards inhalation of titanium dioxide and causing cancer.
What about propellants inside of sunscreen cans? Is there any negative effect from propellant? Or
that's a whole other issue.
I mean,
we're not getting into today
right.
because there's all sorts of propellants. Some claim to be more natural than others. There's companies that use like the pump sprays and such, which get messy and hard to use. But yeah, the thing is that's a whole other story because propellants. Let's stick to sunscreen today. And
that's fine.
Not get
I just want to go down these rabbit holes and just
the
dive
fluorocarbons
deep.
and stuff. We don't need to get into fluorocarbons and all that.
Well, yeah, especially if they affect the ozone, and the ozone affects us towards the amount of UV light that comes through. So
yeah, I mean,
we could just keep going on this all the way.
Just towards a endless circle.
That's fine.
Okay, so let's really quickly. So there's a couple more interesting things. We're getting close on time, but there's a couple more interesting things that I do want to discuss. The first is I want to really quickly go into the light spectrum that I put the pin in before because we talked about UVA and UVB, and there's also UVC, and then we also have the visible light. One of the kind of more trendy, sexy topics, I guess you would say. I don't know if I call it sexy, but trendy topics is the blue light blockers.
Oh yeah.
And you talked about how the eye, yes, the skin, not necessarily. Let's start with just really quickly UVA, BC, differences and why that matters.
UVC has a lot of energy, but it's absorbed by the ozone, so it doesn't actually penetrate down to the earth.
Unless you're in Australia.
Unless you're in Australia or the one of the poles.
Which has a higher incidence in Australia of cancers.
Correct.
Skin cancers.
Then you've got UVB, and then you've got both UVA and UVA1 and UVA2. Then you go into the blue light, which is the very edge of the spectrum, visible spectrum that everybody associates with the rainbow.
Right.
And then you go into infrared and then so on out the range.
Well, infrared's the other side, right?
Correct.
So you go through the rainbow. So you're at UV, then it goes to blue because it's one of the
purplish blue.
Blue, but then all the way over to it's Roy G. Biv. So Roy's on the other side. Yeah. And so the red is infrared, which actually, interestingly, tends to be looked at as healthy spectrums of light, where people will sit under a red light for many, many minutes, sometimes hours.
And get cellular activity as far as based on the red light.
Yeah, they think it's mitochondria activation and such. So it's used for aesthetic purposes and also for like anti-acne, all that stuff. Or anti-inflammatory, I guess it would be more likely. Actually, blue light is used for acne, but there's another reason for that.
Right, because of the porphyrins.
Because of the porphyrins, so which also cause oxidation. So I'm not sure. It does kill the bacteria, but it also causes free radical damage. So one could argue whether that's the best way. And that's a whole other ball game. But so I think most people that are consumers, the way that I think a lot of dermatologists would say is remember UVA because it ages your skin, and UVB for burn because it burns your skin, and UVC because if it gets you, it'll. Yeah.
It was nice of them to name it. See, that's a better naming convention than the SPF 15 and 30, in my opinion.
Okay, so the last topic is vitamin D.
Oh, we're not going to talk about coral?
Oh, we'll talk.
Don't have time for coral.
Well, we might.
Okay. Well,
vitamin D will go fast. Then we'll talk about coral afterwards because we don't want to forget our friends, the coral. Is that plural for? Is it corali, coralus?
Coraline, I think, was a movie.
Okay. But vitamin D. So I have a dear friend who goes out and lays in the sun all the time. He's convinced that melanoma has nothing to do with UV exposure because people can get melanoma in places that the sun don't shine. The fact that we're not saying that it has to shine directly on the spot you get it doesn't mean that it's not it doesn't cause it.
Correct.
Because cancer can be systemic in the sense that if you affect one area, cells can move and go to other areas.
Right.
Regardless, he'll sit out and sunbathe for hours he'll put oil on his skin, which is something he used to do back in the 60s and such.
Yeah, that's fried chicken level.
Right.
Everybody talks about coconut oil and the
Yeah,
like.
get nice and crispy for you.
That's what he uses, coconut oil. And so I basically am like, you will not catch me. I don't hardly ever go out because I'm just so scared of getting wrinkles from the and so I put on sunscreen, but I really rather just avoid the sun. And he's always like, you're going to get like multiple myeloma because you're not getting vitamin D. And I'm like, no, because I take it as a supplement.
Right.
So let's talk about that. What is there really a rationale about needing to go out in the sun to get your vitamin D? What would you say?
I would say yes, there is a rationale for it, but not as extensive as needed. Because I always heard a rumor that even like 15, 30 minutes of being in the sunlight gives you 1,000 times your daily dosage of vitamin D, or it's not you don't need to be out for a long time to get it. Now, is that true? I have no idea.
Well, let's
Again,
find
Florida
out.
logic.
Well, you can actually get through your diet, to your point, or through supplements. So you actually really don't have to go out and get UV exposure. And that was really a big piece that Barbara Gilchrist presented as far as when this was coming about, 15, 18 years ago, as far as when this was really hitting the high interest rate or high interest that people need to go out and get the sun, because again, if they weren't going out in the sun, they were getting all these different forms of cancer. That simply wasn't the case. And when you look at it, exposures of 10 minutes or less can actually still, in certain individuals, cause DNA damage.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they call sort of sunburn cells actually form even at a quarter MED. So if you, what it takes to get where you can't even see redness on your skin, actually still could cause thymine dimer damage, as well as sunburn cells, which lead toward or potentially can lead toward cancer. So again, if you're taking reasonable dietary intake of vitamin E or vitamin D, you're getting what you need, and you don't necessarily need sunlight to have that have benefit.
Right, and I think also people don't realize the amount of incidental sunlight that we get just by walking to our car,
Right.
or through windows even, because you can get UV exposure through windows.
Yeah.
Not all windows.
UVA.
Yeah.
Right. So let me ask you maybe a dumb question, but for vitamin D, is there a difference between taking a supplement versus getting it from the sun, and that if the sun's hitting your arms, your face, your legs, versus the internal process of taking a vitamin D pill, or does it all distribute the same throughout the body?
Well, the absorption is a little bit different, but again, the amount and percentage of absorption is a little different between that as far as taking it in the gut through taking it through conversion in the skin. But again, vitamin D is essentially vitamin D.
Yeah, it's as long as it's bioavailable and your body can use it. So you just need to find a good supplement.
Right.
But there's a lot out there that's available. Okay, so lastly but not leastly, the coral reefs. Let's talk about our friends at Coral Reefs, because that's another controversy.
Yeah.
That it was said that there are certain sunblock or sunscreens. I don't know why that's still in my head after all these years, but there's certain sunscreens that actually, because of tourism, have leached into the ocean and started to kill our coral reefs. And there was actually a publication that basically, in their opinion, proved it. But since then, it has...
There's been a number of papers that have come out that show that actually it's not true, or nowhere near the concentrations that were tested in those particular studies are actually exposed to in the reef. They've looked at the ocean concentrations, and they're anywhere from a log order of magnitude to 6 order log, so a million times less actual exposures in the ocean versus what they expose those coral
in their testing.
And so they've done additional testing. There's been, I think, 9 studies now that have tried to repeat those particular early studies that were done. University of Maryland has done it, University of Monaco, again, some fairly well-known universities that have a marine department is sort of doing testing, and they haven't been able to show it.
Right.
And so actually the Congress has asked for a review of this by NOAA, and to look at this and see and come up with a, is this real or is this not real?
So is reef safe sunscreen just a marketing gimmick, or is there actually some sort of benefit to it?
That's a good question. The thing is, right, really part of, a marketer's problem is that when something catches on, regardless of whether it's true or not, you have to protect the brand.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times they'll put something on there because it's true. They use whatever they have as accordance to whatever regulations, but they're also doing it simply because they want to make sure that people don't discount their brand from the ones that do claim it. It's a bit of peer pressure.
Yeah.
And the real thing is if it means something, it's good. But the fact is there's really not evidence that it's occurring. It's actually people peeing in the water. No, just kidding.
Well, actually, bring up a good point. Actually, on the peeing in the water.
Yeah.
Ammonia actually helps the coral.
Yeah. So you should pee.
Oh, that's good to know.
So nitrates actually that are used for fertilizers actually are what's causing all of the bleaching of the coral, because essentially it takes oxygen away from the coral. But
I believe there's also some ties to like warming and such.
Well, and it's warming as well.
So you heard it here, kids. Pee in the ocean. Just go to
like
town.
They don't already.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you don't.
They've actually done. Believe it or not, they've actually done studies where they have fish, around the coral. The ammonia that they create
is true.
It helps benefit the coral, and
that makes sense. That's how the ecosystem works, right?
Yeah.
That it's the circle of life.
So when
it's a study I would have volunteered
when you
for.
overfish, or when you put too much nitrates or fertilizer in the water, or the water becomes too warm, those are really the things that are causing the bleaching, not sunscreens yet. Again, sunscreens or cosmetic products, or in this case, OTs, over-the-counter drug products that are meant for skin, are easy targets. And so, you look at Hawaii, they've got another ban that's going to come in place in next year that they're trying to get essentially all organic sunscreens banned. You got Florida that's trying to do it, but it's been kind of blocked a little bit. Palau has got their ban on pretty much all sunscreens. Yeah. And you'll see it as towards if you go anywhere there's coral, in Mexico or wherever, they'll have bans as towards where they can't sell sunscreen. Now that doesn't mean you can't bring it in. And most people do bring in their sunscreen and use it. But again, when you weigh the differences towards what this is doing towards the safety of individuals, is towards not using sunscreen because they don't want to harm the coral. They're not harming the coral. They're actually causing more damage to
they're harming themselves while saving the coral. Well, no, actually.
Well, the coral wouldn't be
not doing anything indifferent to the coral.
Indifferent to the coral.
Yeah, and so that's where again, responsible marketing comes in, and unfortunately, when there's such competition with things like sunscreen, you get people that are causing a bit of disruption by trying to get people in a flurry about things that may or may not matter. That's marketing, though. That's right. You're trying to basically carve out a niche. So, Crown, we try to be responsible, but we also realize that there's certain claims we have to make in order for people to adopt it, whether it means anything or not. And so we do, I think, have coral reef safety on ours as well. Because it is.
Well, it
is. Yeah, it's not that it's not.
So there isn't anything that's wrong with that. It's essentially the industry practice.
Right.
And again, like you said, is that it doesn't harm coral, so it's
reef safe.
It's reef safe. And remember, you have millions of bacteria on your face. Oh, wrong.
Wrong.
Sorry.
But I do want to know, Chad, if the people that are listening to this and made it to the bitter end want to find you, is there any social media that they can go to?
No, there is not.
Not that you want to be found on?
Not that I want to be found on. If you want to learn more, though, I highly encourage everyone to, if you're not familiar with PRP, go to ProGenPRP.com, as well as, check out all of Crown Aesthetics' other great offerings. I mean, it's exciting to be here, but I'm not big on social media. I actually, I've made 2 Facebook posts in the past 3 years. So,
well, we will be talking about PRP at some point on this podcast. I don't know if I'll bring you on because I'm just kidding.
I'm biased.
No, you definitely are biased, but it doesn't mean you don't have something to say, right?
It's true.
So we loved having you, and I'd love if you would come back for some of our other podcasts because you are way higher energy than me, which is because I can be a little dull. So
I had organic caffeine. That's why.
Oh, that's what I had. And then Brian, where would they find you?
At home.
At home with your dogs?
With my dogs.
Smart man.
And just lounging outside, but wearing sunscreen.
Okay. Well, you can find me on Insta at dr.t.hitchcock. And of course, on the Beauty and the Bacteria series, as well as the Skin Science podcast. And so thank you for listening or watching, and we will see you next time. Good night.